On the 10th day, with no food left, they made a decision so extreme that when the world found out, it demanded the Vatican weigh in. 16 people walked out of the Andes alive, and this is exactly what it cost them. On October 13, 1972, a chartered Fairchild FH-227 turboprop plane carrying 45 people took off from Montevideo, Uruguay, bound for Santiago, Chile. On board were members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, their family members, friends, and crew. They were young, most of them in their early 20s. This was supposed to be a sporting trip, a few days in Chile, a match, some time away. Nobody on that plane had any reason to believe it would be anything other than a routine crossing. The route from Montevideo to Santiago required crossing the Andes, one of the longest and highest mountain ranges on Earth. Bad weather forced the plane to stop overnight in Mendoza, Argentina. The following day, the pilots attempted the crossing through the Planchon Pass. Visibility was poor and the clouds were thick. What happened next was reconstructed from the flight recorder and survivor testimony. The crew called their position over the radio as if they had already cleared the highest peaks. They had not. They were still climbing directly into the mountains. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, the plane struck a mountain ridge. The right wing sheared off on contact. Then the left. The fuselage became a hollow metal tube hurtling through the air before slamming into a snow-covered glacier and sliding several hundred meters before stopping. 12 people died in the crash itself or within hours of it from their injuries. 33 survived the initial impact, stranded at roughly 3,600 meters, or about 11,800 feet, in one of the most remote areas on the continent. The cargo hold had been torn away during the crash, taking most of their supplies with it. What remained was scattered across the snow, a small amount of chocolate, some wine, crackers, jam. They used seat cushions and luggage to insulate the broken cabin against temperatures that dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, -22 Fahrenheit, after dark. Several survivors had broken limbs, deep lacerations, and head wounds. 3 of the rugby players, with no medical training, took charge of caring for the injured using whatever was at hand. Within days, even those provisions were nearly exhausted. On the 8th day, they got a small transistor radio working. What they heard ended whatever remained of their passive hope. Chilean and Argentine search and rescue authorities had officially suspended the search. The white fuselage against the white glacier had been invisible from the air. The weather had been unworkable. And as far as the outside world was concerned, everyone on that plane was dead. The survivors sat inside the wreckage of their aircraft, at altitude, in the dark, and listened to a broadcast confirm that no one was looking for them anymore. Their food was gone within days of hearing that broadcast. At that altitude there was nothing, no plants, no animals, no insects, no water that didn't require melting snow. But there were the bodies of those who had died in the crash, preserved in the freezing temperatures. The survivors, Catholic, raised in a culture with strong religious convictions around death and the body, gathered and debated for days. Several later described the conversation as the most painful of their lives. They ultimately reached a collective decision: they would consume the flesh of those who had died in order to keep themselves alive. Multiple survivors have described framing it, at least in part, as a form of communion, the dead giving themselves so the living could continue. That framing was their own. On the 17th day, an avalanche buried the fuselage in the night. 8 more people died, suffocated under packed snow. The survivors still inside clawed outward with their hands and whatever objects they could grip, until someone broke through to the surface. They remained trapped under the snow for approximately 3 days before fully digging free. Of the original 45, 27 people were now alive. Winter in the Andes had not yet reached its worst. 2 people in particular became the center of what followed. Nando Paradu was 22, a rugby player who had spent the first 3 days after the crash unconscious. His mother died in the crash. His sister died on the mountain 8 days later from her injuries. Roberto Canessa was 19, a medical student. Both concluded independently and then together that if they were going to survive, they would have to walk out of the Andes themselves. They began quietly planning an expedition with no climbing equipment, no cold weather gear, and no reliable information about how far they would have to travel to reach Chile. Before the final attempt, a smaller group had tried heading east, reasoning correctly that east meant descending toward Argentina. That expedition turned back without finding help. The leadership group ultimately concluded that west, toward Chile, offered the better chance of reaching inhabited land. The problem was visible to anyone who looked. A peak of staggering scale sat directly between the crash site and anything resembling civilization. Paradieu later described climbing to its summit expecting to see green valleys and roads. What he saw instead was range after range of mountains, white and silent, extending as far as he could see in every direction. On December 12, 1972, 60 days after the crash, Paradieu, Canessa, and a third survivor named Antonio Vizintin set out west on foot. They had sewn sleeping bags from the insulation inside the aircraft seats. They had fashioned crude snowshoes from seat cushions. They carried food wrapped in cloth. Vizintin turned back after 3 days at Paredo's instruction, to conserve what remained for the two going forward. Over the following 9 days, Paradieu and Canessa crossed glacial terrain, climbed slopes without equipment, and descended into the first valley they had seen, covering what survivors and later researchers estimated at roughly 38 to 40 miles of some of the most difficult mountain terrain in the Western Hemisphere. On the 10th day of the trek, December 20th, Canessa and Paradieu saw a man on horseback on the far bank of a river too loud and fast to cross. They shouted. He could not hear them. The man, a Chilean cattle herder named Sergio Catalan, saw them, threw a piece of paper and a pencil across the river tied to a stone, and waited. Paradieu wrote a note explaining who they were, that they had survived a plane crash, and that 14 more people were still alive in the mountains. Catalan rode for approximately 10 hours to reach authorities. The note he carried set the rescue operation in motion. Chilean rescue helicopters reached the crash site on December 22nd and 23rd. The 14 survivors still at the wreckage had waited 72 days. Rescuers found men who had been presumed dead for over 2 months, severely underweight, wind-burned, but alive. All 16 survivors who made it out were hospitalized and physically recovered over the following weeks and months. What they carried psychologically, including the full weight of what they had done to survive and who they had lost, was something each of them has spoken about publicly in the decades since, in different ways and at different lengths. When it became public that the survivors had consumed the bodies of the dead, the reaction was immediate and divided. There was genuine condemnation alongside expressions of understanding. The Vatican was asked directly and, according to widely reported accounts from the period, senior church figures indicated that the act could be considered morally defensible under the doctrine of extreme necessity, though the Vatican's formal position was nuanced and has been reported with varying degrees of precision by different sources over the years. What is documented clearly is that most major religious authorities who commented did not condemn the survivors. The survivors themselves have never hidden what happened. They have spoken, written, and given interviews about it openly for 50 years. The full story was first told in Piers Paul Reed's 1974 book Alive, written with the cooperation of the survivors and built from their direct testimony. It became an international bestseller and remains the primary written account of what happened. A 1993 film adaptation brought it to a wider audience. In 2023, J.A. Bayona's Spanish-language Netflix film Society of the Snow, made with the survivors' involvement and drawing on additional testimony and research, reached a new global audience and received widespread critical recognition, including Spain's submission to the Academy Awards. Nando Paradieu, who lost his mother and sister in the mountains and then walked out of them on foot, became a businessman and author. His 2006 memoir Miracle in the Andes is one of the most detailed first-hand survival accounts in print. Roberto Canessa became a pediatric cardiologist. The other survivors built careers, raised families, and have remained in contact with one another. They have returned to the crash site together on memorial expeditions. They still gather. The bonds formed in 72 days on a glacier have held for over 5 decades. 72 days in conditions that should have ended every one of them. 16 people who refused to accept that the search being called off was the same thing as it being over. What the Andes survivors did is documented, verified, and still difficult to fully absorb 50 years later, not because of how desperate it became, but because of how deliberate they were through all of it. They made the hardest decisions imaginable, held each other together, and when the helicopters finally came, every single one of them was still fighting to be found. The mountain kept the wreckage. The glacier kept the dead. But it could not keep them. If stories like this one stay with you, consider subscribing. There are more of them, and every single one is real.